So we've been talking about friendship. And the interesting thing about that is, well, first, just the fact that we're talking about friendship, right? This is not a topic that a lot of people in our culture stop and think about, let alone talk about. I want to talk now about some dynamics of friendships. For us to think through, what is the nature of friendship? How do they work? Particularly, what are the types of friendships? I'm going to propose that there's sort of concentric circles, or should be concentric circles in our lives, with regard to the types of friendships we have. And again, the fascinating thing about this is that while all of us have friends, and while our friendships tend to be pretty important to people, at least, again, if you ask a poll of the American populace, around 3/4 of the people will say that having close friends is high on their priority list. And yet, again, we don't often analyze what makes for a good friendship. How do we be good friends? How do we grow as friends? We tend to sort of think of friendship as just things that happen. We're going to talk first about friendship and time. So here's the thing. With regard to every relationship we'll ever face, one of the limiting factors of just being human is that we all have a limited amount of time. We have 24 hours in a day, and I don't care who you are or what you do, you'll never stretch it to 25. We have 7 days in a week, 365 days in a year, and all of us live, well, usually between 70 to 90 years of age. We often forget this as we're moving through life, but we have a finite quantity of time given to us. And it's only as we start to realize just how short life is and how fast it goes, that we realize time is probably our most precious commodity. It is a gift from God. The question becomes, how do we use that gift of time? How do we, particularly in this context, how do we use that gift of time in terms of friendship? You know, think for a moment about how, up to this point in your life, how you've made decisions, relational decisions, about where to spend your finite amount of time. Have you thought of that? I realize looking back at my life that frequently I never actually analyzed how I allot this precious resource of time to particular relationships. And yet, the ancient world knew that this is exactly what we have to do. Aristotle once said that a friend to all is a friend to none. That there's a quality to friendship that means it can't be something you have with everybody, if for no other reason than the amount of time we have, for which a good friendship requires a significant amount. That means we can only spend so much time within a limited range of relationships. A friend to all, Aristotle said, is a friend to none. This really picks up on a theme that we've looked at and can revisit again here for a moment in Scripture. Proverbs, for example, chapter 18, verse 24 says that a person of many friends comes to ruin. But, on the other hand, there's a kind of friend that sticks closer than a sibling, closer than a brother or sister. Talking about that deep, committed friendship. If we look at Jesus' life, we can see an intentionality to Jesus' layers of relationship. As everything, Jesus becomes a model for us, and here again in terms of how he arranges his life according to friendship. At the very inner circle of Jesus' life, according to the gospel stories, we see that Peter, James, and John, 3 of the 12 disciples, form this inner circle for Jesus, his closest network of relationships. These 3 men. And it seems that in certain very important episodes in the Gospels, Jesus, at crucial moments, is surrounded by these 3, Peter, James, and John. Beyond that, we have the 12 disciples, kind of the next concentric circle of friendship in Jesus' life. Just around that, we have a third layer we could call his traveling companions, which of course included the first 2, but also involved other people, including a number of women who, according to Luke's gospel, traveled with him town to town, were part of his, again, one of his inner circles. Past that, we have a fourth layer we could call the 72 that Jesus poured a large amount of time into and sent out in terms of ministry. Beyond that, we have the crowds. You might call this Jesus' casual relationships. But Jesus arranged his life such that these 5 circles were pretty clear, and that each circle got more time from him in terms of personal investment. Jesus intentionally managed his finite amount of time into the relationships in terms of how close and crucial they were to him. When we think about this, what we're really asking is the question of how do we foster the appropriate amount of intimacy to the appropriate level or layer of friendship. You know, when you think about intimacy, which all of us crave and all of us really require to be fully human, intimacy with God, intimacy with others, we realize that what intimacy is, if we break it down, really I think is 3 things. It's commitment, it's openness and honesty, what we call vulnerability, and it's time. In other words, the more intimate a relationship, the more committed it will be, the more open, honest, and vulnerable it will be, which always requires trust of each other, and the more time investment it will require in order to develop that intimacy and vulnerability, in order to nurture that commitment. So these 3 factors are crucial to this question of intimacy. Because time is one of those factors, and because time is limited, we will always be limited in the number of intimate relationships that we can have. Our intimacy scale must be measured and managed properly. If not, we will be tempted to do what this culture so often does, is to take that limited amount of time and stretch it very thin but shallow in order to have a large quantity of relationships but not much quality in terms of depth. This is where the intentionality and really seeking God's leading for us in our lives about which circle of people, which will be a rather small circle, are going to be intimate friends, which are called to be good friends, and which are simply going to be what we have to call casual friends. All of us have to make these decisions. When we talk about intimate friendship, most theorists who analyze friendship say that if you can find 1 to 3 deep, intimate friends, you're doing pretty well. In a recent poll among American adults again, it was said that most people have 2 close friends. That's actually down from 3 close friends from several decades ago. But in a sense, that isn't bad. Having 1 to 3 very deep, close, intimate friends may be what we should be shooting for in terms of the commitment, openness and vulnerability and trust and time that's required for those kind of relationships. Maintaining those relationships, that small group of intimate, deep, inner circle relationships, will then become a priority in our lives. Fred Markert, a gentleman who was in YWAM for many years, a YWAM leader, once spoke these words in a class that I had with him. He said, "You are only as spiritual as your most committed and intimate relationships are godly." So Fred challenged us by saying that our measure of spirituality is not simply measured by how much time we spend with God or what good acts of charity we do. It's also measured by the quality of our relationships. He went on to say this: how you treat and relate to your most committed and intimate relationships is a measuring stick of your maturity. And how you operate in these relationships is a measure of our spirituality. Makes perfect sense. You remember that so many times Jesus or the other New Testament authors would say things like, I think of Jesus in Matthew 5, where he says, if you're worshiping God and you remember that someone has something against you, stop worshiping, go be reconciled to that human being, then come back and worship God. In other words, how we're doing with God in terms of our relationship with God is always conditioned by how we're doing with others in the relationships in our lives, because God set it up that way. how we relate to the images of God, other humans, affects how we relate to God himself. So intimate relationships, they're going to be few if we're doing life well. They're going to be few, but they're going to be clear. They're going to be intentional. They're going to be deep. They're going to be tied up with commitment and vulnerability and trust and a significant amount of time, a priority of time that goes to those relationships. Now, past our intimate circle of friends, we can talk about the next circle. We can call them good friends. I've heard people who study friendship say that when you move to the next layer, good friends we'll call that, here you're talking about maybe 4 to 12 friends within this next layer in terms of what we can manage regarding time. Now, there's still going to be some commitment there, though not perhaps as much intense commitment as the inner circle of intimate friends. There'll still be required an important level of openness and honesty and vulnerability, though maybe not as much as the inner circle of intimate friends. And it will require time for these good friends, though not as much time probably as that intimate circle. Beyond intimate friends and good friends, once you get beyond perhaps those roughly 15 people in your life that you can manage in a healthy way of pretty intense friendship, beyond that, largely everyone else is going to fall in a category of casual friendship. It doesn't mean it's bad, not at all. That's simply what we as finite human beings have to do. And we have to be clear, again, which person at which season of our life is called for what circle. One of the principles here in any relationship is what we can call the easy in, easy out, difficult in, difficult out principle. What I mean by that is, if it's easy to get into a friendship, easy to get into any particular relationship, it's also going to be rather easy to get out of that particular relationship. If there's not much cost to getting into a relationship, there probably won't be a lot of cost to getting out of it. Conversely, if it's difficult to get into a relationship, think, for example, in our culture of marriage. That's kind of difficult to get into marriage, right? Someone has to find someone who they're willing to commit to for life and vice versa. One has to arrange usually a wedding and a ceremony, and there's cost involved. There's quite a lot of difficulty with getting married. And for that very reason, marriage is one of the relationships in our culture that has the most stick-to-itness. We still have a pretty abysmal divorce rate, but let's put it this way. More marriages hang together than friendships tend to. Why? One reason is that friendships are easier to get into. You can just meet someone casually at work and start calling them a friend. But not many people just accidentally fall into a marriage. That takes intentionality, time, planning, and cost. So this is a principle we need to think about, that the easier in, the easier out. The more difficult, the more intentional to get in, the higher the cost, the more resilient that relationship's going to be. Now, one of the challenges of our culture is that casual relationships are so plentiful, and the ability to connect with such a wide range of people is so doable that we are tempted to fill our lives with casual relationships. Without intentionality, that's exactly what will happen to us. Again, technology has just made this possible. We can, with a click of a button, be in conversation with someone on the other side of the globe today, something that was just simply not possible through most of human history. But with the technological capacity to have a lot of relationships comes the important requirement of being intentional about how we manage that technology and the possible relationships that it brings into our life. To fill our lives with casual relationships will inevitably take our time and will therefore limit the amount of good or intimate friends that we're able to have. Again, it's about thinking through, with the leading of God in our lives, about what He's calling us to be and do in terms of these various spheres of relationship. One of the temptations in life, particularly in our culture, is to enter into cost-free intimacy, instant intimacy. It can feel good. And yet, the downside of it is that it is dangerous relationally and can foster immaturity in our relationships. Because of the wide range of people we have access to, we can quickly be vulnerable and have them be vulnerable to us, but outside of commitment. What I would call false intimacy is when we have the vulnerability of being intimate without the commitment behind that. That can leave us in very dangerous positions, where we quickly, for various reasons, reject or are rejected by others when that supposed intimacy is no longer convenient for one or the other any longer. Vulnerability without commitment is a dangerous place to live. So we have to think through, once again, in our friendships and other spheres of relationship, how do we wisely allot commitment, vulnerability, trust, and time?